Fort Banks was a U.S. Coast Artillery fort located in Winthrop, Massachusetts. It served to defend Boston Harbor from enemy attack from the sea and was built in the 1890s during what is known as the Endicott period, a time in which the coast defenses of the United States were seriously expanded and upgraded with new technology. Today, the Fort Banks Mortar Battery is on the National Register of Historic Places. The fort was active during World War II as the site of the Harbor Defense Command Post for the harbor defenses of Boston, and was greatly expanded with numerous temporary structures. Because of its campus-like appearance and the fact that it was located on land close of Boston, the fort was known as the Country Club by Coast Artillery soldiers pleased to be posted there. Fort Banks was named for Nathaniel P. Banks, a Civil War general, the 24th Governor of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts and a former Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives. Construction. In 1892, construction began on the fort's 4 mortar pits, each of which was to hold 4 of the huge, new 12-inch coast defense mortars, each capable of firing a half-ton projectile over 6 miles out to sea, effectively commanding the northern approaches into Boston Harbor. Construction on the mortar emplacements was completed in 1896, making this the oldest Endicott period fort in Boston's harbor defenses. The 2 eastern mortar pits were designated as Battery Sanford Kellogg and the 2 western ones as Battery Benjamin Lincoln, making these the first Endicott gun batteries to be completed in Boston and the first 12-inch coast defense mortar batteries to be completed anywhere in the U.S. The mortars were taken out of service in 1942, and in 2007 the fort was added to the National Register of Historic Places. The 4 mortar pits were laid out in a design known as an Abbot Quad, which contained the 16 mortars in a sort of square of squares. Quote, "This arrangement was designed such that if all the tubes were aimed in parallel and fired at the same time, in a huge salvo, they would bracket an attacking ship with fire, somewhat like a huge shotgun blast. Since each shell could weigh over half a ton, a 16-mortar salvo of over 8 tons of explosives was hoped to be a decisive deterrent to ships approaching the northern channels into Boston Harbor. In fact, the Army had planned to build 2 16-gun Abbot Quad arrays at Fort Banks, but ran out of budget before being able to complete that project. The mortars, the M1890 Mi 12-inch mortars at Fort Banks, were some of the most powerful coast artillery pieces of their era. They were able to fire either high explosive or deck-piercing shells. The former weighed 700 pounds each, and the latter weighed in at either 700 or 1,046 pounds. These mortars, firing the heavier shells at an elevation of 45 degrees, had a range of 12,019 YDS. Each M1809 M1 mortar on an M1896 carriage weighed a total of 78.5 tons and was intricately geared to enable it to be turned and raised or lowered. The shock wave from firing one of these weapons, echoing off the enclosed walls of the mortar pit, was often so strong that it destroyed sensitive equipment mounted near the pit, broke nearby windows, and knocked doors off of nearby structures. When a mortar battery like those at Fort Banks was fully manned, guidelines called for 2 mortars in a pit to be manned by a pit commander, 2 mortar squads of 17 enlisted men each, and an ammunition squad of 16 enlisted men. One of the last versions of the manual for this mortar gives details on how it was crewed and fired. The photo of Kellogg Pit B at top right clearly shows another unusual feature of the mortar pits, the data booth. This small concrete room, built into the western wall of the pit, with its pit viewing slits, is visible just left of center in the photo. The This boot received and passed to the mortar crews the data that had been calculated in the plotting room by the range unit's settings for the mortars in order for them to hit the targets. Batteries. The batteries included surface pits, underground magazines, and connecting corridors of the Fort Banks Mortar Batteries. The mortar pits, flank magazines, and underground corridors are not open to the public. Battery diagram. The battery diagram is displayed with east at the top. For an idea of scale, the measurement running west from the easternmost edge of the wall at the top, down the center of the central corridor to the westernmost edge of the wall at the bottom, is roughly 430 feet. To orient this diagram to the current surface geography, the point at which the central east-west and north-south galleries cross is approximately here. Looking at the diagram, one can see that the original mortar pit walls, completed in 1896, were much narrower than those that can be seen today. This enlargement of the pits took place because it was found that the smaller design did not allow enough room for the mortars to be properly served. Originally, the two central corridors completed in 1896 were to have provided the only ammunition and powder storage for the batteries. Indeed, blueprints from 1896 show rows of stored shells drawn in along these corridors and in some rooms. A total of some 12 48 3-foot shells, 624 3.8-FOOT shells, and 208 5-foot torpedoes were indicated as planned to be stored in the corridors. An extensive system of shell trolleys ran through the magazine rooms and corridors to transport the heavy shells out to the pits. The 1910 to 1914 modifications added a series of lever-operated switches to some of these shell trolleys, so that different stacks of shells could be accessed. The section view in the blueprint image below also illustrates how these shell trolleys were intended to work. The 1910 to 1914 work added flank shell and powder storage rooms to both batteries and also a central magazine to Battery Lincoln. These additional rooms are at the surface on the Battery Lincoln side, but underground for Battery Kellogg. Although on the Battery Lincoln side the roofs of these magazines are today on the surface. Originally all of these magazines were covered with 10 to 20 feet of earth as protection against enemy shells and bombs. This new construction expanded the magazine storage capacity by a tremendous amount. The old corridors offered about 3,500 square feet of storage. The new work added almost 15,000 square feet of new storage capacity. World War II. Fort Banks was the World War II location for an anti-aircraft defense command post, a meteorological station, and a bunker holding the secure central switchboard for the Harbor Command. At one time, the fort became the headquarters for the Army's U.S.Coast Artillery Regiment, which garrisoned much of the Boston Harbor defenses in the early part of World War II. It also had a 250-bed hospital. After the fort was declared surplus by the Army in 1947, its land was purchased by the town of Winthrop and by private developers for municipal facilities and apartment uses. Cold War. In the 1950s, Nike anti-aircraft missiles were based on the site, and in 1959, the Martin and FSG-1 anti-aircraft defense system for the 40th Radar Station was partly set up at Fort Banks for a Sage missile mastered test by NORAD. Historical marker. A plaque on the site, provided by the Fort Banks Preservation Association and located just outside the portal to Battery Kellogg Pit B, recounts a terrible accident that took place in one of the mortar pits on October 15, 1904, during a practice firing. The plaque indicates that a charge went off prematurely in one of the mortars without the breech of the mortar being closed and locked. killing 4 and injuring 9 others. Today, the flank magazines of Battery Kellogg are crowded with debris left over from former service as a town-sponsored haunted house at Halloween, and have temporary plywood walls with doors and windows added here and there. Much of the space is occupied by leftover materials stored by the town. On the western end, the 2 mortar pits have been filled about halfway up and paved over, and are now used as parking lots. The central magazine casemate, which sticks out between the 2 pits, housed the Harbor Defense Command headquarters during World War II. The rooms inside this casemate have suffered fire damage, leaving them littered with charred wood and other debris. The rooms of Battery Lincoln's flank magazines have been renovated and are now used by the maintenance department for the nearby condominiums. The lower central corridors between the batteries are mostly clear of refuse. Today, almost all traces of the fort except for the mortar pits and magazines have been destroyed. Of the 4 mortar pits that originally made up the armament of the fort, only one survives in close to original condition. Pit B of Battery Kellogg. A good deal of the original floor of this pit is still visible, due to excavations by the town in 1992. The western 2 pits have been partially filled and then paved over for parking, while the southeast pit has been covered up by a new building. The Winthrop Department of Public Works now occupies part Battery Kellogg and uses some of the former magazines for storage, while parts of Battery Lincoln are used for offices and storage by property managers for the nearby apartments.